We're at 2 Chronicles 22-23, both chapters. This is Athaliah, and she is the only woman who was a ruler in Judah during the kings, the time of the kings. And we studied her very briefly during our study of the story, the 4 quarters we did, the full year we did, and we went through 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. But we'll be at 2 Chronicles 22-23. And this is, she is probably, and I think we would all agree, and especially after we get done with this, that she was probably, if not the most despicable character in Scripture. She was very close. She made the top 5 for what she did. Also, it is critical to understand, or it is understanding, what we understand is she could not get enough power. And every time she wanted power, it resulted in catastrophe. And as we go through this, we know where we are in 2 Chronicles at this point. There are 2 kingdoms, Judah and Israel. And the 2 kingdoms, if we look kind of at a wiring diagram, if you would, we know that Judah has been ruled by the house of David. David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, and we're now at Jehoshaphat. Now, the kingdom of Israel, Athaliah's grandfather is Omri, and her father is Ahab, and her mother is Jezebel. So she comes from a fine lineage. By the way, we're going to see a lot of J and A in the names in this. Jezebel, Ahab, Athaliah, Jehoshaphat, and so forth. We're going to see a lot of that. So what we find, though, is it's very interesting that her name means the Lord is strong, or the Lord is exalted. And as a person, she did everything in her power to make that not happen. And even then, God won out. But the point of it is, and I don't know why Jezebel and Ahab would name her that. They didn't know God. They worshiped Baal. They were big Baal worshipers. And so was she. So as this is opened here, we excuse me, we see Jehoshaphat is in the latter stages of his reign. He has been good so far, but he's going to do 2 very important things that mess it up. And number one that he did is he wanted to enter into an agreement with Ahaziah, who was the king of, or Joram, rather, who was the king of Israel, wanted to enter into a deal where they were going to control the sea-going merchant vessels in the Mediterranean. So they entered into this deal to build these ships, and what basically happened was it blew up in their faces. God destroyed those ships because that is not what he wanted. And also what he did is, let's get this right now. He had hopes of bringing Athaliah to Judah as a wife for his son, and that would influence her for the good. That ain't going to happen with her. That is not. He was terribly wrong. Instead, she was too much like her mother. In some ways, it could be said that she was her mother twice over, or even worse than her mother. We all know Jezebel. But that did happen. And she was married to Ahaziah and ruled. She was in Israel, but she had a tremendous impact on him, counseled him for the wicked things, and did the same with their son, who then became king in Judah. And we'll get into that right now as we start with chapter 22. And one of the things we have to keep an eye on here is the lineage of David. The house of David is important because of the covenant that God made with David that the Messiah would come from his line. If his line ever ends, or if it had ended, then that would have been the end of that. Gotta have the one I want. All right, we get to verse 22. Now, in verse 1, now the people of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, Joram's youngest son, king in his place, since the raiders, that's not the Las Vegas Raiders, who came with the Arabs into the camp and killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, son of Joram, king of Judah, began to reign. Okay, now he is in Judah. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned Jerusalem for 1 year. That tells you right there. Remember, we studied the kings. Solomon,
it's a short reign,
David, Solomon, all reigned for 40 years. Okay, when you reign for a year and you're 22 years old, that is not a good sign. He followed the ways. Now, also, his mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of Omri. And of course, again, we said that makes her the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. He too followed the ways of the house of Ahab. He did, whenever we see the house of Ahab, that is not a good sign either. Following the house of Ahab, they were Baal worshipers. You recall we studied that. They had the Asherah poles and all of the altars anywhere throughout the area, the high places, the low places, kind of like CBS. One was on every corner in the neighborhood. But it was one of these things where that's where they were. They were worshiping idols, which we know there's only one God, and it ain't Baal. For his mother, now this is our good friend Athaliah, encouraged him to act wickedly. Now, I want a show of hands from the mothers in the audience. How many of you encourage your kids to act wickedly? Okay, thank you. I knew that was going to happen. I knew that was a very safe vote. All right? But you think about, she's not just being neutral in this. Let the king be the king. No, she's in there encouraging him to be wicked. She had done that with her husband, his father. Not good. That's obvious. And this is one of the, verse 4 there, this is one of the most quoted, you will remember from our studies of the kings. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And how many of those kings did evil in the eyes of the Lord? A lot of them.
22.
A lot of them. As the house of Ahab had done, for after his father's death, they became his advisors to his own undoing. So here we have the king of Judah, 22 years old, taking his advice from advisors from the house of Ahab. Can anything good come from that? No. And we can guarantee it's going to be bad, badder, and baddest.
That's why he only ruled for a year.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And then whoever takes over after that, oh, that's a good one, right? And it went from bad to worse. Or as I used to say, got worse. Just got plain worse. All right. And I was corrected on that, so I don't do that anymore. Only for the effect. And this, and as we say, therefore, after his father's death, they became his advisors to his undoing. Didn't help him. He also followed their counsel when he went to Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, to wage war against Hazael, a king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. Arameans wounded Joram, so he returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds they had inflicted on him at Ramah in his battle with the king of Aram. Now, then Ahaziah, son of Jeroboam, and so forth, king of Judah, went down to Jezreel to see the son of Ahab, because he had been wounded. Okay, goes down, is kind of king to king, kind of seeing how you're doing, does a hospital visit, I guess, if they had hospitals, which they didn't. But through Ahaziah's visit to Joram, God brought about Ahaziah's downfall. When Ahaziah arrived, he went out with Jordan to meet Jehu. Another J, okay? Keep that in line too, David's lineage and also the J's lineage. Jehu, son of, I don't know how this guy got in it, Nimshi, he has an N there, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. So Jehu is not a friend of either of these two guys. While Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he found the officials of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's relatives who had been attending Ahaziah and killed them. He then went in search of Ahaziah, and his men captured him while he was hiding in Samaria. He was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said he was the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. So there was no one in the house of Ahaziah powerful enough to retain the kingdom. Okay, so what do we have there? A leadership vacuum. What happens when we have a leadership vacuum? Answer, it gets filled. Now, sometimes it gets filled by people we may not want to have filled. Other times, it gets filled by great leaders. And we saw that throughout the time that we studied the Kings in that study that lasted over a year long when we went through the entire Bible. So a leadership vacuum existed. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw her son was dead, what did she do? Apparently didn't mourn him. She proceeded to destroy the whole royal family of the house of Judah. And who was she destroying? His sons. And what were they to her? Grandsons. All right, grandmas, how many of you would go out and kill all your grandchildren?
They just feel like it.
Well, sometimes, yeah, I know, sometimes you can say, yeah, you know, we do that again. Yeah, but no, and there were probably, I believe there were upwards of 50 or near 50 grandsons. Near 50 grandsons. So the line of David would go through them, right? Well, what did she do?
Kill them.
She set about to kill the royal family. And then we have another J coming in, Jehoshaphat. And I mispronounced it and I called it Sheba. No, it's Jehoshaphat. Okay, so say it fast. Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Joram, right? And Joram, I should have said also, died of a very serious, very awful disease. And you know what? Nobody mourned him. Isn't that a wonderful thing? God destroyed him with this horrible disease, and nobody mourned him. Kind of like for those of you who watch every year, watch the movie A Christmas Carol, where the mourners had to be paid to mourn Scrooge's death, and they only went because they could get a meal. That's kind of a sad commentary, isn't it? But what she did, she comes to save the day, and her husband, who is the high priest or the priest there, is going to save the day as well. She stole Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered, and put him and his nurse in a bedroom, because Jehoshaphat the daughter of King, okay, the wife of the priest, we have another J, Jehoiada, was Athaliah's sister. She had hid the child from Athaliah so she could not kill him. And what did she do right there? Preserved the line of David. He remained hidden with them at the temple of God for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. There's your filling. I fill that vacuum. I'll fill it. And there she is. Here's the one who has encouraged the leaders, her husband and her son, to do wicked things. She didn't just say be wicked, do wicked things. Make sure what you do is wicked. Well, now she doesn't have to tell anybody because she'll do it all on her own. She's very good at that. Now, I think it's interesting they hid him in the temple of God because I don't think Athaliah would have found the temple of God. She was a Baal worshiper. I mean, she might accidentally go down the wrong street and end up there, but that was not what she was going to be doing. And it's kind of interesting, we'll get to something else that kind of looks like the temple of God at this time may have been more of a storage unit. They did have service, they did perform the services there, but they were nothing like what was about to come. So, in the 7th year, Jehoiada, the priest, showed his strength. He made a covenant with the commanders of units of the hundred. And here we go again. We're going to get all kinds of names here. Azariah, son of Jehoram. Ishmael, I don't know how he got in there, son of, well, here we go, Jehohanan. Azariah, son of Obed. Obed doesn't belong there. Maaseiah, son of Adiah. And we have Elishaphat, son of Zikri. So we went from A to Z in that group. But what these people are, 2 Kings 11:4 refers to them as the Karaites. And they are basically from the Aegean area, so we got the A back in there, and they are descendants of the Karathites. These were the people who were used to guard the temple. And that's how sad things had become. It was almost an outsourcing of the guards of the temple. All right.
So they don't distinguish when they're saying that Jehoshaphat was Athaliah's sister. Was Athaliah her mother, or was there a different mother?
Let me check.
I just wish that, if everybody been named Bill and Sam and William, it's just, the family trees on these things are such a mess. I mean, go back and look at your own family tree and try to figure out aunt and uncle.
I think she was a half sister,
Half daughter.
half daughter. Yeah, she was our stepdaughter.
He's
Because
a priest.
Athaliah's married to Joram over here, and then just Jehoshaphat comes through that line, but
He's
as
there.
Ahiah or
Yeah.
Athaliah comes from the direct line of David. So she's one off, but she is also one of the best.
Like a Christmas.
Jehoiada.
Your relatives,
He's a priest.
Who's who?
Yeah, that's probably what this was like,
Yeah.
especially when you got 50 grandchildren.
She is.
You know, they have to buy gifts for 50 grandchildren. Not half.
She's
Not half.
the priest.
All right, but anyway.
Her nephew.
Now, what he did, he then went throughout Judah and gathered the Levites and the heads of the Israelite families from all towns. When he starts to get the Levites together, this is a sign that the temple and the worship of God is going to follow. The two of them, she saved the king, the future king, and he gets the religious functions back on track. And he said and the whole assembly made a covenant with the king at the temple. Now, how old would the king be? He's probably about 7 years old now, because this is the 7th year. He was about 6 before he was going to be executed. I mean, he was about 0 or just born. He was a newborn. It was probably 50th in line, but whatever, he survived. Jehoiada said to them, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord promised concerning the descendants of David. What was that promise? The Messiah will come from your line. So what Athaliah did to be wicked turns out to be good for God. God, it worked out fine, as it turned out. It's horrible to get there. Now, this is what you are to do. This guy, this priest, he must have had some military background, because he gets them all there, and they're going to go into a war plan sort of thing, if you will. Now, this is what you are to do. A third of you priests and Levites who are going on duty on the Sabbath are to keep watch at the doors. A third of you at the royal palace, because who's in the royal palace now? We probably got
Joy.
Athaliah is there, because
He's really.
Joash has not been, or what's his name?
Yes, Joash.
I get all confused here.
Joash.
Anyway, the son, surviving grandson, is probably
Joash
not in the palace.
Big kid.
I would not put him near her. Okay, because she's vicious. So so when he was referring to the king, or referring to the palace, guarding the royal palace was for what purpose?
Keep her from gaining access to the king.
There you go. You keep your enemies under surveillance, and that's what they were doing. And a third were to be at the foundation gate, and all others are to be in the courtyards of the temple of the Lord. No one is to enter the temple of the Lord except the priests and Levites on duty. They may enter because they are consecrated, but all the others are to observe the Lord's command not to enter. So we see we are reestablishing many of the laws of Moses and the procedures for how this is to be done. He's reestablishing them, and he's got the enforcers there to do it. The Levites are to station themselves around the king, each with a weapon in hand. So we now have one of the early references to the Secret Service. Now they've got their weapons in hand here, and anyone who enters the temple is to be put to get death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes. And this again is the not yet made king, but he is, as far as they're concerned, kings. The Levites and all the men of Judah did just as Joah the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath and those who were going off duty, for the priest had not released any of the divisions. This was an all hands on deck deal. All right? And that's what they were going to do. Then he gave the commanders of the units 100 spears and the large and small shields that belonged to David and that were in the temple of God. Again, these were sort of stored in the temple of God. Because yes, there were services, but it was not like it was in the days of David or in the days of Solomon and Jehoshaphat and some of those. This had fallen into disuse. Now, he stationed all the men with a weapon in his hand around the king, near the altar and the temple from the south side to the north side. And the king again is Joash. The priest and his sons brought out the king's son, Joash, and put a crown on him. What is that symbolic of? This is the king. What about Athaliah? She's an illegitimate ruler, self-appointed, grabbing that power. She had to have slaughtered her grandsons in order to get that. And because she was such an evil person, that didn't bother her, apparently. And then they presented him with a copy of the covenant. It'd be like giving him the scriptures. This is what we follow. And realize this kid's about 7 years old, but he probably understood the symbolism of what was going on. And proclaimed him king. They anointed him and shouted, "Long live the king." Oh, but there's somebody in the palace. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and cheering as king, she went out to them at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The officers and trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. and musicians with their instruments were leading the praises. And in one of the most hypocritical moves, what does she do? She
Crowd's
tears
treason.
her robes and says, treason, treason, spoken from one who committed treason. I guess she is sort of an expert on it. She did commit the treason originally to get into the, and it's interesting though that she does that. Can you believe? Well, does she have any limits to what bad she can do? I'm afraid it's a bottomless pit for that one. That's not really funny. Pathetic. The priest sent out the commanders of the units of 100 who were in charge of the troops and said to them, bring her out, her Athaliah, between the ranks and put the sword to anyone who follows her. Now what he's doing here is he's not going to let her enter the grounds of the temple. Just going to come out and she's going to be, they're going to take care of her there. For the priest had said, do not put her to death at the temple of the Lord. So they seized her as she reached the entrance of the horse gate on the palace grounds, and there they put her to death. All of this power grabbing, all of slaughtering her grandson, or having them slaughtered, comes to an end right there. And she accused them of treason. But great things are here to come as well. The priest then made a covenant that he, the people, and the king would be the Lord's people, reaffirming where they should be. All the people went to the temple of Baal. Remember we talked about worshiping Baal? Well, they had a temple for him in Jerusalem, presumably. Went to the temple of Baal, and what did they do with it? They tore it down. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. People tear down this temple, and that's exactly what they did. And also, they smashed the altars and idols, and just for good measure, killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. So the worship of Baal will continue in Israel, but for Judah, it has come to an end. And it came to an end because of what the priest and his wife did to save the line of David. Then the priest placed the oversight of the temple in the hands of the Levitical priests. That's where it belongs. And that's where apparently, because he's doing it now, was not the case. To whom David made assignments in the temple to present the burnt offerings of the Lord as written in the law of Moses with rejoicing and singing as David had ordered. He also stationed gatekeepers at the gates of the Lord's temple so that no one who was in any way unclean might enter. So the temple has reopened. He took with him the commanders of hundreds, the nobles and rulers of the people, and all the people of the land, and brought the king down from the temple of the Lord. They went into the palace of the upper gate. That would be the gate the king would travel. It doesn't go through the lower gate, it goes through the upper gate. And seated the king on the royal throne. Yet another symbolism that this is our king. 7 years old, this is our king. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm. And why was the city calm? Because Athaliah had been slain by the sword. You can imagine how this must, the people in those days, of course, obviously they did not have the internet, which meant that they were totally
You
ignorant
have to be 100.
because they didn't have access to all this information. But they knew what was going on.
Good.
They knew what Athaliah was doing. They knew that she had had her grandson slain. I mean, something like that was common knowledge. And can you imagine how the people felt about that? Here is this illegitimate ruler killing her grandsons to prevent them from taking the rightful throne, as they should have. And now
That's
we've got to.
Not shocking, but what's
That would have been.
hard to understand
But
is that
now,
they had a plan for
the
one
people
person,
rejoiced,
and so
the
allowed.
city was calm.
Yeah.
but
All
that's-
right, now, what are some of the lessons we learned from this?
Does it ever specifically say that how long Jehoiada ruled? Because he died at 130.
Oh, who now?
Jehoiada. When he's old and full of years, and it's in verse 20 or 15, after he set up the temple and all, that he died at the age of 130.
Oh, the priest?
No, Jehoiada, the king.
Oh,
That was the priest that raised up, Joash.
You're getting ahead of us.
we will, at 2 this afternoon, we'll have a debate on this. All right, let's go.
Jehoiada. Jehoiada? Is the king, right?
No, Jehoiada is the,
Priest, then. Okay.
Well,
all right, there won't be a debate at 2. Yeah,
How many J's?
we've solved the problem.
They call them Bill and Sam.
Yeah, well, and that's one thing, but everybody has a J or an A.
Yeah.
So now, wait a minute, does this go this way or this way? Or is this a priest, is this a king? Well, Athaliah's root problem was a brief example of pursuing success and power at all costs. She knew no limits as to what she would do to get that power and to keep that power. She had been accustomed to getting her way all the time. After all, she was Jezebel's daughter. And it's kind of this is a sad thing to say about Jezebel and Athaliah. It's kind of a race to see who was the worst, who was the most vile, who was the most wicked. She had found a place of unimpeded influence over 2 kings of Judah, her husband, Jehoram, and her son, Athaliah. When all was gone, when they were gone, what could she do now? She had nobody to advise, so she went in and took the leadership by wiping out what she thought, wiping out the entirety of the royal family of Ahab. And she was in an unbridled, opportunistic, self-serving ambition. Athaliah saw a chance when leadership in Judah was at its weakest. She jumped in. She let no one, not the line of David, not the people of Judah, not her own grandchildren, and not even Almighty God, stand in her way. Well, it lasted for a while, but ultimately, what we learned from this too is this take charge at all costs ambition can inflict a lot of pain and suffering on a lot of different people, and ultimately upon her.
how was she able to do that? Did she have followers that enforced what she said?
I think because of her connections to the house of Ahab and the king of Israel, the kings of Israel,
So she had influence.
she had that influence. Because that's what Jehoshaphat wanted to have happen. He wanted the two kingdoms to come together with a royal marriage of one from each. Well, that's not exactly how it worked out. But I think she had probably a lot of power and authority there. But we see here that on that day, nobody stood up for her, apparently. Well, lessons from a power grabber. Make sure that our ambitions line up with God's desires and plans for us. We can say ambition itself is not a problem. And Paul tells us in Romans 15:20, I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. That is a good ambition. What is bad? Well, in Philippians, which we didn't get to study, I'm sorry, but get over it. No, we didn't get to do that. What does it say? Do nothing out, what does Paul say? Do nothing out of selfish ambition. That's a big difference. You can have ambition as Paul did. He had ambition to preach. And we remember from studying Romans, Paul was always all into everything. But we studied last quarter, Paul we studied Paul as he went from Saul to being Paul, we see when he was in for something, he was all in. And he had ambition to do that, but it wasn't selfish. Or vain conceit, rather than humility, value others above yourselves. I don't think Athaliah valued anybody above herself. Nobody. She certainly didn't, I would say, I think we can say this, from all the evidence we have, we can infer she didn't believe in God. Yahweh God. She did not believe, she believed in God, but Baal, perhaps. But it's also, as we look at this, it's easy to dismiss Athaliah because none of us comes that close to, we would say, well, my ambitions aren't anywhere close to what she did. But here's something very interesting. There is a writer by the name of Liz Curtis Higgs, from whom Dewey and the lesson plan has been taken from a book she wrote called The Really Bad Girls of the Bible. Yeah, this was one of them. Now, it's kind of easy to dismiss her because we're not that ruthless. I don't think anybody in this room is even close to that ruthless. But she goes on to say, if I consider her take charge at all cost personality, I have to admit an uneasy shiver of understanding ripples across my soul. How many social situations have I dominated by insisting on having the last word?
I have a granddaughter named Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah. She has to, I always love when she starts doing this, you know, that, oh, great, the thing's coming apart here. But anyway, I've had students at LCU and students here who always want to have the last word. And I would say, okay, are you done? Yes, I'm done. All right, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. And but I don't have to have the last word. You just proved it. Every time I said something, you rejoined. Well, sometimes that can happen, can't it? And how many business meetings have I ended up calling the shots or making sure that everything was done right? And by right, by my specifications. How many family dinners have ended on a not so sweet note because I copped a my way or the Interstate 27 way, the highway, right? And sometimes that can happen, and that's on much lower level, but that's for us. That's the lesson we can take from this. Also, power grabbing, I love this, reaps what it sows. And that's what it did. She inflicted death. She inflicted wickedness. And what happened to her? She died. Not of natural causes. Not at an old age. In the Sunnyvale rest home for kings of Israel and Judah. No, didn't die that way. She died with the sword. After accusing everybody, that is such, well, it shows her personality. To call them treasonists or committing treason with what she had done, I mean, that is absolutely consistent with her. So it does reap what it sows. James 3:16, real quickly there, for whenever there is a wherever there is jealousy and self-ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. And then we go on to the last one here. Pursuing one's own self-ambition may result in fighting against God. One of the examples that is given here is from Acts 5:38-39, where the Rabbi Gamaliel, we know about him from our study last quarter about Saul at the time studied at his feet. He was a wise rabbi, and he told the Sanhedrin, when they had the apostles there before them, because they would dare to preach in the name of Jesus, Gamaliel said, leave these men alone, let them go, for if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. I think that really sums up what we need to know about that. And God's purposes, and this is another thing, God's purposes are always going to be accomplished. She had all these ambitions. She had all this power. She misused it. She misused it when she was not a ruler. She misused it with her husband giving him bad advice, wicked advice, do wicked things, and her son. Neither one of them ended well. One died of a horrific disease and nobody went to his funeral. They didn't even miss him. And another one died after a year. He was executed in execution style. All right, now next week, and this is the final week, I promise. Unless we have a hurricane, tornado, and a snowstorm all at the same time.
Flood, flood.
No, I'm not. I'm not. We will be looking at Korah, Dathan, Abiram, the rebellious. And this is in number 16. Remember, this was one of the times of overthrowing Moses and Aaron and the leadership. And we'll look at these three individuals in Numbers 16 next week. And then the week after that, we will actually take up the 2 verses from Philippians. No, that's it. Any questions? I'm sorry, I don't give you enough time to comment. Any questions or comments? And this is a bad time to ask that because everybody's saying, don't you dare say anything. We want to get out of here.
I was a pastor, sister, I would hate to have to write a family tree. All these people,
Oh,
you know, in the name, and I sit there and listen to you read through lineages and you think, how do they think up this many different names that don't sound anything like any name we've ever heard?
yeah. Right.
You know, it's like when you go, we got the kids from Keegan, you know, the Ian and all the different names that they have, or for the people from Sweden have all these double letters in their name. And you just think, who thinks these up? You know?
And when you find out that it's been hundreds of years.
And they look at us and say, where do y'all think up your name? You know?
I had that happen because in Korea, when I was stationed there, one of the Korean attorneys there told me, you know, we only have 24 last names in this country, and you've got all
All
kinds of
kinds of them.
How do you keep up with that? And I
When you go to a
didn't.
hotel, everybody that runs a hotel is named Patel.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's like they call themselves John Doe so that you can't look them up in the phone book, but it's kind of like a name that everybody uses in business.
yeah.
You know, and but this is so confusing. So that would be a few things, but just keeping all these people straight, keeping track of everybody. It's just hard.
There's some friends.
Like say all the J's and the A's, you know, you get Elijah and Elisha, and everybody gets